My name is Chris Monk. I'm a professor here in the Department of Psychology here at the University of Michigan. This evening, it's my pleasure to have Dr. Kevin Cokley join us to present some of his very important and exciting work. Kevin is a professor in the Department of Psychology here at the University of Michigan, where he holds the University Diversity and Social Transformation Professorship. He is also the Associate Chair of Diversity Initiatives and Space Management within the department. Prior to arriving here in 2022, he was a professor at the University of Texas in Austin and also the chair of the Department of Educational Psychology there. Kevin did his undergraduate work in psychology at Wake Forest University. He then got a master's in education from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He then received his PhD from Georgia State University from the Department of Counseling and Psychological Services in Atlanta. Dr. Cokley's research examines the psychosocial experiences of African American students and students of color, and explores the imposter phenomena and its relationship to mental health and academic outcomes. On that topic, he is the editor of the new book, The Impostor Phenomena, Psychological Research, Theory, and Interventions. He is the past editor-in-chief of the journal Black Psychology and holds the title of Distinguished Psychologist from the Association of Black Psychologists. He is the past president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race, and was elected to fellow status in the American Psychological Association. In addition, he's published extensively in academic journals, delivered talks to diverse audiences from academics to financiers and beyond, and he contributes widely to the media, including numerous press interviews. The title of Kevin's talk is, Why Do Successful People Feel Like a Fraud? Here's Dr. Kevin Cokley.
All right, thank you for that warm welcome. How's everyone today? We're good? All right, well, it's my pleasure to speak to you on a topic that I am very passionate about. Why do successful people feel like a fraud? So I'm going to walk you through an outline of the talk. So I'm going to start off by giving us a definition of what we mean by the term imposter phenomenon. I'm going to spend some time really fleshing that out. I'm going to spend some time talking about the origins as it was originally conceptualized within the literature. From there, I will describe what has been commonly referred to as the imposter cycle. Afterwards, I will share a few examples of celebrities and leaders who have reported feeling like an imposter. From there, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about research that has attempted to look at imposter feelings and achievement. From there, I will examine imposter feelings among racially minoritized groups. After which, I will provide some summary points. And then, of course, what I've learned over the years as I've done research in this area is that you just can't present the problem and not offer some attempt to provide some strategies or interventions. And so I will share some individual and institutional strategies that some have found to be helpful. And then from there, I will give the final summary. And I hope that is acceptable to you, because that's what you're going to get, because it's too late for me to change my slides at this point. So I'd like to start off by showing this image. And it's a woman looking in a mirror. And in the mirror, so the woman is wearing the crown of a queen. She's looking in the mirror. And she's surrounded by all of this evidence of her incredible accomplishments. And yet, when she looks in the mirror, she sees someone who is not as accomplished as she is. And she in fact, doubts herself. And this image, I think, beautifully captures what we mean when we refer to the term the imposter phenomenon. Now, I'm going to try something here, and I have worked, so I don't know if you've done presentations and you try to do live polling, and it's hit and miss. Like sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I'm going to see if it's going to work today, and if it doesn't, we'll just have to play it by ear. Okay. If you have your devices, if you could go to the pollev.com/Kevin Cokley 779. Now, when I prepared this, there was actually something that you could scan. It was literally up there this afternoon, and it has now disappeared. So Apologies for that, but hopefully you can get to the survey from that link. Is it work? Oh God, it's not working. No, jeez, I'm so okay. See, I need what? Wait a minute. Some servers underway. Someone is completing it. So it's working for you.
Yep.
For those who's having problems, what's the nature of your problem?
I think on the first screen, asks you to register. If you hit skip for now.
Yeah, just skip that. So I'm going to give you just a few moments. It's only 3 short questions, so you should be able to complete it relatively quickly. I'm just excited that it's working.
Sorry, do we go on to number 2 as well?
Oh yeah, yes,
Oh, okay.
yes.
Okay.
Complete all this. Complete all of them. Sorry.
That's okay.
I was getting confused. I'm like, why are the numbers going down? I thought it was 10 surveys, not 8. Okay, yes. Complete all of them. All 3 questions. And if you could give me a thumbs up when you are finished. Okay, let's go ahead and see what our results show. So at times I feel my success has been due to some kind of luck. And as we can see, many individuals indicate sometimes and often and very true. And so this is not a surprise. Whenever I do these talks, this is typically the type of responses that we get for this item. For the next item. It's hard for me to accept compliments or praise about my intelligence or accomplishments. All right, okay, so again, we see that more often than not, people are reporting endorsement of this item. And then finally, I'm disappointed in my present accomplishments and I think I should have accomplished more. All right. Okay. So we see that the endorsement of these items is, is fairly common in this very small sample that we have. So these items represent something that we refer to as the imposter phenomenon. So by show of hands, how many of you have heard of the imposter phenomenon? Okay. And we'll say a little bit more about the other term that you probably are more familiar with, the imposter syndrome. By show of hands, how many of you have heard of that term before? Oh, interestingly, it looks fairly even. Okay. So what do we mean by the term the imposter phenomenon? The imposter phenomenon is the experience among academically or professionally successful individuals of feeling like intellectual frauds. It's the idea that if someone could peer within the windows of your soul, they would see not the incredibly polished, accomplished, competent individual that your achievements would suggest, but instead that they would see someone who is fooling people, that somehow you've been able to fool the world to being something that you don't believe yourself to be. So this idea is referred to as the imposter phenomenon. And it is quite commonly experienced by many people. We know from the most current research that upwards of 80% of people have experienced feelings of imposterism. So let's do another quick poll. By show of your hands, how many of you at any point in time during the course of your entire life, how many of you have ever felt like an imposter? Raise your hands. Okay, keep your hands up. Look around. Now, I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a statistician, but I'm going to say this is probably more than 80%. And every time I give this talk, it's the same thing. The majority of people in the audience raise their hands. So we know that this is incredibly popular. And so, but how did the term, where did it come from? Like what is its origin? So it comes about as a result of the work of 2 white female psychologists, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. And they were doing therapy, or sometimes what's referred to as growth groups, or classes with over 150 highly successful, primarily white middle to upper middle class women. And these women came from many different types of backgrounds. Some were undergraduate students, some were graduate students, some were doctoral level faculty, some were already professional women in various sort of occupations. They all were at a private Midwestern school or a large southern urban school. And they were between the ages of 20 to 45. Now, I want you to keep these demographics in mind because we will revisit them when we start talking about some of the critiques of the original sort of conceptualization of the construct. Again, mostly predominantly white women. But this is where it emerges. And when I came across the term, it must have been maybe 15 or so years ago, I was doing, mostly work with, African American and other minoritized students, and I was doing a literature search. I forget exactly what I was looking up, and I happened to come across this article that referenced the term imposter phenomenon, and it sounded really interesting. So I read the article, and it really spoke to me, and it seemed to capture much of the experiences and feelings that I had when I attended Wake Forest University back in the late 80s, early 90s, as a black male student from a sort of working class environment, attending this elite, private, predominantly white school, and just sort of feeling out of place and wondering if I belonged, wondering if I had sort of fooled. I mean, I did not have the term or the language for imposter feelings, but after I read about it and started to reflect on my experiences, I said to myself, wow, that's what I was experiencing, but I didn't know the terminology. And so you might have thought, okay, so that was many, many years ago. I was an undergraduate student again, late 80s, early 90s. So surely Dr. Kevin Cokley would not, feel that way before. I've done okay professionally. But interestingly, that's not the case. So here I am at the University of Michigan, premier public institution, and one of the best psychology departments, not only in the country, I would say in the world. This was a place that I looked up to, that I always imagined myself, that I dreamt about being here. But I never in my wildest imagination thought that a place like the University of Michigan Psychology Department would offer a job to someone like me. So lo and behold, I get an offer. And I happily accept it. And then I get here. And I start looking around, so I'm kind of an academic stalker. So I like to look up like metrics and publications and just the general sort of reputation of my colleagues. And I start looking up their reputations. And I'm like, oh my God, how in the hell did I get here? Because I literally, every person that I looked up in my mind was an academic superstar. Every single one. And then I started to question, so why did they offer me a job? I don't belong here in the midst of these individuals who are among the world's leading psychological scientists. I did not see myself that way, and yet here I am. And so this feeling of impostorism is very real for me. It's very personal. And so when I talk about it, I'm not speaking about it abstractly. I'm not speaking about it just theoretically. I'm speaking about it because it's deeply felt in my soul. Because even now, I still struggle with those imposter feelings. So at any rate, it's a personal sort of concept to me, and it emerges out of a clinical context, meaning that psychologists observed it with primarily, again, white females. And how did it present itself? So it wasn't the case that you had women going to the therapist saying, I'm here today because I feel like an imposter. That's not the way that it presented itself. It presented itself differently. So for example, the clients would make references, about their intelligence and saying things like, I don't feel like I'm as intelligent as my colleagues. Another cue for the therapist was that these individuals, the clients, often reported no experience of an internal sense of success, meaning that as the therapist was listening to them and hearing the examples of success, the client had a difficult time truly internalizing that success and believing that they were worthy of it. And then once the term imposter phenomenon was introduced to the clients, they agreed and said, you know what, that's it. I am an imposter. I feel like an imposter. In many instances, they believe themselves to be mistakenly admitted to graduate or professional school. Again, if I refer to my own experience, I will never forget when I was a master's level student in counselor education at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. And when I made the decision that I wanted to apply to PhD programs, again, questioning whether I would actually have what it takes. I didn't even tell you about my undergraduate experience, y'all. Like that's a whole, if you know anything about my bio, you know that I had some struggles as an undergraduate student. But we won't go there. But when I made the decision to apply for doctoral programs, and back then it was snail mail, so we were getting like letters. I remember getting the letter, and I was so nervous. And when I opened that letter, and I think the first one was from Georgia State University, and it was an offer of admission or acceptance, I was so happy, but I thought that it might have been a mistake. Like I had to look at it multiple times, because again, if you know my story, my academic story, and from whence I came, and that stays with me, I thought to myself, is this real? Like I just, so it was hard for me to even accept the fact that I had gotten accepted into a doctoral program in psychology, in counseling psychology. So individuals who experience impostorism sometimes think that they were mistakenly admitted to graduate or professional school. And it takes them a while to get beyond that. And high test scores, they attribute to luck, to mistakes in the grading, or just faulty judgments of the professors. Because again, they have a difficult time believing in their success. They sometimes report feeling overvalued by their colleagues, by their peers. So when their colleagues or peers give them compliments about their intelligence, they have a difficult time really and truly accepting it, even though they're hearing it, but they're like, no, you're just being kind, you're being nice. I don't believe that about myself. And the key here is that repeated successes did not break the cycle. So no matter how many times there was evidence of success, it failed to break the cycle of their internalization of feeling like an imposter. So these are some of the key characteristics of what we call the imposter phenomenon. Now, point of clarity here. Sometimes people will reduce the imposter phenomenon to just simply self-doubt. And we've all heard of self-doubt. We're all familiar with self-doubt. The lack of confidence in oneself and one's abilities. However, there's more to feeling like an imposter than just self-doubt. Self-doubt, of course, is a natural part of life. We all, at some point in time, have experienced self-doubt. And it oftentimes shows up in multiple areas of life. Now, the example that I like to give is, if I'm on a basketball court, I felt a lot of self-doubt about my ability to play basketball. Don't let this athletic build fool you. I can't play a lick of basketball. I can't hit the broadside of a barn. Whatever stereotypes you might have about black good dudes do not apply to me, because I'm not good at basketball at all. So my self-doubt is justified because I've never demonstrated competence on the basketball court. So that's true self-doubt. When I'm in a swimming pool, I cannot swim. People have tried, instructors have worked with me. My partner, who's a wonderful swimmer, has tried and has given up because I cannot swim. For those who who are familiar with the stereotypes of black folks can't swim, I fulfill that stereotype. I cannot swim. I've tried to learn how to swim. I think it's too late for me. My kids can swim, but it's too late for me. At least that's what I tell myself. So my self-doubt in a swimming pool is well justified because I've never been able to swim. I've never demonstrated an ability to learn how to swim. And so that's true self-doubt. But hopefully you can appreciate the difference between self-doubt and imposter feelings. Because with imposter feelings, these are feelings where individuals have demonstrated competence. They've demonstrated excellence in some domain. And yet, in spite of having demonstrated that excellence and competence, they still feel like imposters. So if you ever hear someone just simply reduce imposter feelings to self-doubt, now you know, and you can correct them. Well, no, imposter feeling is not simply just self-doubt. There is a distinction, and hopefully you can appreciate the difference. Okay. The other sort of misunderstanding about the imposter phenomenon is that it's a disorder. And so it's important to note that while the imposter phenomenon is recognized certainly as an important clinical phenomenon, it is not recognized as a psychiatric disorder, which is one of the reasons why I and many others who do work in this area avoid referring to it as imposter syndrome. There are some people who believe that it should be considered for inclusion in the next diagnostic and statistical manual. That's sort of like the mental health Bible for mental health professionals. Some people believe that it should be included in that. But those of us who do work in this area strongly disagree with it. And you know, I could get into some really specific technical reasons why that should not be the case, and I won't bore you with those details, but suffice it to say that it's not a recognized psychiatric disorder. When the creators of the idea, the construct, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, when they identified characteristics, they never identified those characteristics in terms that would overlap with what we would consider to be psychiatric sort of disorders or designations. So if you ever hear someone refer to it as a disorder, as a syndrome, as something that should be seen as being placed in the mental health Bible, the DSM, you now know that is incorrect, and we should not think of it that way. And there are some other implications, because once you start thinking about it as pathologically as a disorder, then there are implications for the individuals with whom are experiencing imposter feelings, and we certainly don't want to do that. Okay. So how is the imposter phenomenon created? Now I'm going to refer to the clinical work and observations of Pauline Clance, and I'm going to be completely transparent here. So I'm trained as a counseling psychologist. I have a PhD in counseling psychology, and typically counseling psychologists, work with clients. I made the decision early on that I wanted to be an academic rather than a practitioner, and so I'm reporting to you the clinical observations made by someone who was really truly in the clinical world. So how is the imposter phenomenon created? Well, Pauline Clance, reported that in her work with these very bright and capable women, there were two themes that she observed. The first was these women who reported having siblings or close relatives who were very intelligent. They were acknowledged as being very intelligent. They were given praise for their intelligence. And yet, the clients themselves reported that their families wouldn't give them that same praise. Their families would say that they are sensitive, or that they were socially skilled. They would give, sort of compliments in other domains, but would rarely, if ever, give them compliments about their intelligence. And so the implication to these women was that they could never be as smart as their sibling or relative because their family was not validating their intelligence. And so seeking validation for intellectual competence is what they wanted, but while doing so, they began to secretly doubt, their own intelligence, her own intelligence. And so that was a theme that the psychologists saw in many of their clients. So that's one thing. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, there was the superior messages theme. And so some women reported that as little girls, their families in fact conveyed to them, you know what? You are superior to people. Not only are you smart, you're smarter than your brothers and sisters. You're smarter than your peers, and we want you to embrace that. You are a brilliant young girl. And so they reported being told numerous times how smart and how precocious they were as children. But the problem was that they were also told that because you were so smart and so incredibly gifted, you should never have any struggles in school. You should be able to, whatever classes you take, whatever tests you take, you should be able to go through those classes and tests with ease. And these women reported that was not always the case for them, that there were instances where they actually did struggle, where they had to actually work hard to get those good grades. And so here is reported that they did well, but it was not easy, and because of that, they started to see themselves as imposters. So you can see these two divergent pathways that these women reported from their childhood about their imposter feelings. And so Pauline Clance theorized that for many people, the feelings of impostorism originates from family dynamics. Are you with me? Yep. Okay. There are other factors, of course, internal, so we just talked about these internalized messages from family origins. There's this sort of, again, this looming self-doubt that folks have about their intelligence. A lot of that is due to sort of social comparisons. And then, of course, what we know as psychologists is lower self-esteem is linked to every negative outcome that's out there. So should be no surprise that folks who struggle with imposter feelings oftentimes report having lower self-esteem. So those are pretty common internal factors. And then there are the external factors, the external environment. And there are 4 key external factors here. One, finding yourself in a very competitive environment. And we know that when you're in a very competitive environment, it's almost like a dog-eat-dog sort of situation where you used to hear stories. I don't know if this still happens, but many years ago, you would hear stories of students reporting going to the library back during the days when people actually went to the physical library, and they might go and look up like books or journals, and they would see pages ripped out. It's kind of hard to believe that students actually did that, but that's how intensely competitive it used to be in some places. And so being in places that, environments that were incredibly competitive, where you just feel like you have to do whatever you can to sort of, one up the next person, that is a breeding ground for imposter feelings. And relatedly, being in environments where there's high pressure, high stakes. What immediately comes to mind is being in the medical profession as one example. Stakes don't get much higher than being in a profession where it's literally a mistake can be the difference between life or death. So when you find yourself in environments that are incredibly high pressure, high stakes, that is another sort of breeding ground for imposter feelings. And as we sort of mentioned earlier, being told that you're superior, and yet you struggle to meet those expectations. And then being a minority or being a minoritized individual, being part of a minoritized group. We're going to say a lot more about that in a moment, because there's a lot to be said about that. So we know that these things in the external environment contribute to imposter feelings. So now I want to walk you through what Pauline Clance has talked about and described as the imposter cycle. And I always like to use myself as an example as I walk through this example. So she starts off by saying that there's a project or a task that you have. All right, so my task for today is to deliver a talk about why people feel like a fraud when they are very successful. All right, I've known about it for a while. Dr. Monk asked me to do it, and I said, okay, I'll do it. So that's my task. Now, of course, I felt a certain amount of anxiety. I felt a certain amount of self-doubt because he gave me some links to previous talks that had been done, and I went and looked at some of those talks, and I thought that they did a brilliant job. And so I said, wow, I've got to really bring my A game, because the people who've done this, they've done a great job. So I have some self-doubt, a little worry, and there are 2 different paths that individuals who struggle with imposter feelings might experience. One is the pathway of over-preparation, and the other is the pathway of procrastination. Now, I am the classic over-preparer. So what does that mean? I have done more talks on the imposter phenomenon than I can count. I have spoken everywhere to every possible imaginable audience. I am considered by some to be somewhat of an expert in the field. I've published a lot, so you would think that when I'm giving a talk, it should be second nature, that I should not have to do any preparation. But that's not what happens. Every time I give a talk on the imposter phenomenon, I prepare as though I've never given it before. It gets so bad that my partner says, Kevin, why are you in the office, your home office, not spending time with our kids, preparing for a talk that you've already done probably hundreds of times? And it's because I'm like, it has to be perfect. I can't go and not do an excellent job. Again, even though I have done these talks more times than I care to count. And so I over-prepare, and I spend hours. It might be a presentation that I've done, and I change one slide, and that might take me a couple of hours. So the person who goes down this pathway over-prepares. Can anyone identify with that? And so once the person who goes down this pathway, once they finish, there's a sense of accomplishment, a feeling of relief. Hopefully, there's a positive feedback. So, upon conclusion of this talk, hopefully you'll give me a round of applause. Tell me, great job, Dr. Cokley. And what does the person who goes down the over-preparation path, what do they do with this positive feedback? Well, they discount it, and they discount it by attributing it to just effort. Now, you might think to yourself, well, what's wrong with that? We live in a country where the Protestant work ethic is valued. You work hard, and you prove yourself, you prove your mettle. But the problem here is that when you solely attribute your efforts and success to just effort, then you're robbing yourself of the ability to be seen as someone who is rightly an expert, who is someone who knows their stuff, who has demonstrated incredible competence, and did not just get there just solely by hard work. Now, hear what I'm saying. There's nothing wrong with saying I work hard, because I think people want to be seen as hard workers, but to simply reduce your accomplishments to only hard work and not allowing yourself to be seen as someone who is an expert, who has demonstrated through their past performances, someone who is rightly seen as an expert, it just robs you a little of the ability to just accept that about yourself, and in some ways it kind of diminishes a little bit just saying, well, I worked really hard. I hope that kind of makes sense. So that's the pathway of over-preparation. And then there are others who go through the pathway of procrastination. You might identify with this example. So when I was in college many years ago, you had, there were students who would wait until the night before an exam. And they knew about the exam. They had the syllabus. They knew the date of the exam at the beginning of the semester. And they waited until like the last minute, and they pulled an all-nighter. I don't know if students pull all-nighters today. Maybe that doesn't happen. I don't know. But they waited until the last minute to study. They pulled an all-nighter. They procrastinated. And yet, they were still able to do well, to do very well. So there's a sense of accomplishment, a feeling of relief, positive feedback by way of getting a good grade on the test or assignment. And what does the person who goes down the path of procrastination, what do they do with that positive feedback? Well, they discount it and attribute it to just luck. Whew. I don't know how in the world I was able to do well on that. It was solely luck. Or they attribute it to other sort of external circumstance. For some, it might be, higher power, or something else. Not that, you couldn't have done that if you didn't know your stuff. You couldn't have done that if you weren't, if you didn't have yourself together and had not already demonstrated some competence, but solely attributing it to just luck. So whether you go down the pathway of over-preparation or the pathway of procrastination, these are two instances where you are denying yourself to be seen as someone who's competent by their own sort of merit. And so this can lead to increased self-doubt. It can lead to some mental health concerns of depression symptoms, anxiety symptoms, perceiving yourself to be fraudulent, and then the cycle starts itself all over again. And so this is what Pauline Clance in particular recognized and identified in the clients that she worked with. And so she describes it as the imposter cycle, and oftentimes people can see themselves at some point in the cycle. Okay, I want to sort of transition here for a moment and just give some quick examples of prominent individuals who reported struggling with these imposter feelings. One really good example was Kim Perrell, an author, award-winning entrepreneur, and a CEO. She graduated magna cum laude with a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration. She accepted a job straight out of undergrad as a marketing analyst at .com. And she was 23 years of age, and she had 30 people who reported to her. Now imagine being 23 years old, straight out of college, and having 30 people reporting to you. That's like a dream come true. And so she felt good about herself. And then .com, the .com bust. We know what happened at that time. And so when the .com bubble burst, things fell apart. The company that she worked for went bankrupt. She had to lay off many people who were her friends. And then she eventually was fired. And it was her dream job, and so she found herself now in the position of being broke. And so she was obviously scared. She didn't know what she was going to do with her life. And so she made the decision that she was going to start her own company. And of course, she was terrified. But she said, you know what? I'm going to go out on a leap of faith. She started her own company. And everyone doubted her. They were like, who do you think you are trying to sort of go out and start your own company when you literally just got fired? And she started to internalize some of these sort of self-doubts, even though she had already demonstrated herself to be quite proficient. But she went out on a leap of faith, she started her own company, and now if you were to look her up, she is doing incredibly well. And she says that there were, 5 things that she did to kind of help herself get to deal with her imposter feelings. She talked about it. She talked with other successful people to kind of get some insights into the things that they did to be successful. She invested in relationships with a mentor and peers. She learned to master her emotions. She did not let her emotions master her. She learned to master her emotions. She stopped comparing herself to others. That's one of the classic mistakes that we make. Because when you compare yourself to others, trust me, you're going to find that there's always going to be someone who's more impressive than you. No matter how impressive you are, no matter how much you might have accomplished, there's someone who has accomplished just a little bit more. There's someone who's a little bit more impressive. So don't do it. Now, I'm saying that knowing that I do the same thing. I am always comparing myself to people. And that's part of the reason why I'm always struggling with my imposter feelings, because I know that there are many people out there who are way more impressive than I am. But really, we should try to resist that urge to compare ourselves to other people. And then focus on your vision and your passion, and never lose sight of that. Now, I want to play this clip. Folks who do work in this area are very familiar with this clip. Michelle Obama describes her battles with the imposter phenomenon. Let's see if we can get it pulled up here.
To enter into an elite school when your high school counselor has told you you're not good enough, when all of society sort of looks at kids of color or kids from poor communities or rural communities as not belonging. I, like many others, walked into that school with a stigma in my own head. More young people nowadays call it imposter syndrome. I don't know if they call it that in Britain, where kids like me feel like they don't belong. And I had to work to overcome that question that I always ask myself, am I good enough? And I write about that. That's a question that has dogged me for a good part of my life. Am I good enough to have all of this? Am I good enough to be the First Lady of the United States? And I think that many women, and definitely many young girls of all backgrounds, walk around with that question. But how I overcame that is how I overcome anything: hard work. So whenever I doubted myself, I just told myself, let me put my head down and do the work. And I would let my work speak for itself. And I still find that I do that. I still feel that at some level I have something to prove because of the color of my skin, because of the shape of my body, because of who knows how people are judging me.
And I've seen this clip countless numbers of times, and it never ceases to amaze me that here we have someone who's an Ivy League trained attorney, someone who has achieved at the highest levels, and yet she reports these feelings of impostorism. Another clip that you might recognize this individual.
That surprise revelation from Viola Davis, the new Oscar winner, telling Amy just moments after that that she suffers from something that a lot of women do.
It's surprising because if you really think about it, a lot of women are in the same boat that Viola Davis is, and it's something millions of Americans face, where despite all of your success, you sometimes feel like a fraud. Viola revealing that she struggles with it as well, so take a look. She's now an Oscar award-winning actress.
And the Oscar goes to Viola Davis.
I became an artist, and thank God I did, because we are the only profession that celebrates what it means to live a life.
High achievements, but like many, Davis still battles with doubts as she revealed backstage after the Oscars. Tell me how that feels.
It feels like my hard work is paid off, but at the same time, I still have the imposter, syndrome.
That term, imposter syndrome, is a concept psychologists coined for feeling a sense of phoniness despite evidence of high achievement.
I still feel like, I'm going to wake up and everybody's going to see me for the hack I am. I still feel like when I walk on the set that I'm starting from scratch until I realize, okay, I do know what I'm doing. I'm human.
Some researchers estimate at least 70% of people will experience this imposter phenomenon, and some believe it affects more women than men.
I know I'm not the best, but I'm proud of myself. This is the first year I've allowed myself just a little bit to see that, to realize that self-deprecation is not the answer to humility. That sometimes you could say, I deserve it, that I'm proud of myself, and move on.
Thank you, Amy, for bringing that to us. And joining us now is psychiatrist Dr. Janet Taylor.
So again, here we have another example of someone who has achieved at the pinnacle of her career, has achieved what folks can only dream of, and yet still reports feeling like an imposter. And so again, this just sort of illustrates just how common this feeling of impostorism is, especially amongst individuals who are celebrities and leaders. All right, so I want to just spend just a few moments here talking a little bit about some of the research that has been done, and I will say that research around impostorism and achievement is still growing. There's still a lot that we don't know. It's assumed, of course, that individuals who experience impostorism, that it would impact their level of achievement in some way, but we don't have a lot of consistent evidence one way or the other. And the few studies that have been done, they have been quite mixed. There's some evidence to suggest that it may have achievement more for women than men, so that the impact of impostorism on achievement might be more pronounced for women than men. Not a lot of evidence, but some evidence. And that may have impostorism may have beneficial or deleterious effects for women. So again, it's very sort of equivocal, these findings. I don't want to bore you too much with statistical minutia, but I published a study a few years ago, and essentially what this communicates, one of the things that it communicates is that for women, there was a positive link between impostorism and their grades. In other words, the higher their imposter feelings were, the higher their grade point afterwards. Now, we're not saying it's causeless. It's not a design that would allow you to say it caused, but it certainly was associated in a way that it was not the case for men, which seemed to be somewhat consistent with what little research we've seen done in this area. And so, but there's also been some research that suggests that there might be a negative association between impostorism and achievement at school. It's been found that undergraduate women are less likely to enroll in honors courses than men. Now, this research is a bit dated, and I'd like to see some more current research to see if that's still the case. But there was a study done, and it said that it showed that once women were taught about this idea of the imposter phenomenon, that as a result, more women started to enroll in honors courses. And so it's been suggested that imposter feelings may prevent women from excelling more than it does men, because it prevents them from even taking the leap to go in and take some of these classes. Again, we need to do a lot more work. This is this is the budding, growing field of inquiry. And my research has also found that something that we call maladaptive perfectionism is associated with imposter feelings. So maladaptive perfectionism is when an individual has excessively high standards for themselves, and by excessively we mean not realistic. It's okay to have high standards for yourself. I mean, that's hopefully we all have that. But we're talking about individuals who have excessively, unrealistically high standards for themselves, where they literally expect themselves to be perfect and to never make a mistake. And so we have found that individuals who have maladaptive perfectionism are more prone to feeling like an imposter. And so when intervening with individuals who have imposter feelings, one of the places that you might want to intervene is seeing whether they have realistic expectations for their performance or whether they have unrealistic expectations. It's literally not possible for someone to be perfect all the time. We are human, and by nature of being human, we are fallible and we are going to make a mistake on occasion. And so don't have unrealistic high expectations for yourself that does not allow yourself to be human. That's part of what we see with maladaptive perfectionism, which is associated with imposter feelings. So far the research that I've referenced has been with predominantly white samples. However, I began to wonder how these imposter feelings might look amongst racially and ethnically minoritized groups. As I think I mentioned, the work that I have done over many years has focused a lot on African American students and other students of color. And so I began to sort of wonder whether imposter feelings amongst this group might look different, if there might be some different factors that perhaps contribute to imposter feelings with minoritized populations. Because early research on the imposter phenomenon rarely mentioned race. Maybe a sentence or two, but it was never the focus of early research. And so I wanted to start to turn my attention to examining the role of race in imposter feelings. I want to go over just two quick studies here. The very first study that I published on imposter feelings and mental health examined imposter feelings and something that we call minority status stress with the sample of African American students, Asian American students, and Latinx students. And we were interested in examining if there were some differences across these groups in these different concepts. We found that African American students reported significantly higher minority status stress compared to Asian American students and Latino or Latinx students. But we went into the study hypothesizing that African American students and Latinx students would experience higher imposter feelings than Asian American students. Our rationale for that was that African American students and Latinx students tend to have more negative stereotypes about their intelligence associated with them, and we rationalized or assumed that because of these more negative stereotypes, that would lead to having higher imposter feelings in comparison to their Asian American counterparts. Well, what we found was a surprise. We found that, in point of fact, Asian American students reported significantly higher imposter feelings than both African American students and Latinx students. And this was not something that we had anticipated. And if you're familiar with the process of research, when you have findings that you don't expect and you don't really account for as you're sort of building up a rationale for the study, now you find yourself trying to make sense of and explain those results. And of course, in our discussion, we speculated that perhaps it's the model minority myth that is associated with the Asian American experience. Perhaps the pressure or the stresses of living up to the model minority myth makes it such that Asian American students are even more susceptible to imposter feelings. Again, our speculation, we did not have a design that could allow us to account for that definitively, but that's certainly one thing that we speculated. Again, so cultural pressures of high parental expectations, the stress of being a model minority myth perhaps contributes to these higher imposter feelings amongst Asian American students. We found that imposter feelings were stronger predictors of mental health than minority status stress for all of these minoritized students. That was significant because that had never been, at that point, had never been reported in the literature before. So that was a pretty significant finding. And that imposter feelings was a significant predictor of depression and anxiety for African American and Asian American students, but not Latinx students, which was an interesting finding. Don't know if that was just an artifact of the sample. I don't know that I want to read too much to that one finding. You know, one of the things that we know in psychology is, you know, the replication crisis, so you don't want to make too much of one finding without replicating it over and over again, but just something interesting to note, nevertheless. Okay. Another study we looked at with minoritized students, and this time we wanted to include perceived discrimination, with the thinking being that perhaps with minoritized students, something that might be contributing to their imposter feelings could be their perceptions of discrimination in their environment, which is not something that we have seen reported in the original sort of thinking behind imposter feelings. So once again, we saw that African American students reported higher perceived discrimination in comparison to their Asian American and Latinx counterparts. But this time, there were no racial or ethnic group differences for imposter feelings. So their scores for imposter feelings were basically the same across all three groups, which was different than what we had found previously. Among all students, imposter feelings were partially explained why there was a link between perceived discrimination and anxiety. And we found that there was a stronger impact of imposter feelings on depression among African American students, and a stronger impact of perceived discrimination among African American students compared to Asian American students and Latinx students. So these were some of my early studies, our early studies, exploring these imposter feelings amongst minoritized students. Now we have seen an explosion of research that is being conducted now, where people are now much more interested in trying to better understand the nature of imposter feelings amongst minoritized groups. I'd like to think that I had a teeny tiny role in that. I can't take full credit, of course. I'm not the only one who's been doing work in this area, but certainly I've been fairly vocal about the importance and the need to do work in this area. Okay, so we know that imposter feelings amongst minoritized students, we know and we suspect come from different sources. We know that minoritized students must oftentimes overcome significant challenges, including a lack of representation. When you're in an environment where you don't see a lot of people who look like you, that's a breeding ground for feeling like an imposter. Being in environments that are racially hostile, where you are getting the message that you don't belong here, you are only here because of the color of your skin, that type of environment, we believe, would also contribute to feelings of impostorism, feelings of marginalization, and of course, experiencing discrimination from peers. I can't tell you how many times I've spoken with African American students in particular, and they report, being, especially in STEM classes, and they'll report having a difficult time finding study groups because, and I'm just gonna be honest, because their white and Asian counterparts won't select them to be a part of their group because they don't see them as being intellectually capable of contributing meaningfully to the group. So this sort of discrimination from your peers, you can see, I hope, can contribute to students feeling like an imposter. So this existential question of do I belong is fundamental, we believe, to the imposter feelings that especially minoritized students experience. And the people who are working with me, we have proposed that there is a racialized form of imposter feelings that we need to start examining that has not been really truly accounted for. And we define this racialized imposter feeling as, quote, persistent beliefs, actions, and feelings of intellectual and professional self-doubt among racially and ethnically minoritized people due to experiences and systems of racial oppression and inequity. That's a mouthful, but it's just basically saying, I feel like an imposter because there are cues in the environment telling me that I don't belong, that I'm not smart enough, that I'm only here because of quotas or what used to be referred to as affirmative action, because of the color of my skin. When I'm getting those sort of messages, it's going to contribute to the feelings of impostorism that I am having. And we conducted a study a few years ago, a qualitative study, with Black graduate students examining some of the messages that they received while in graduate school and around impostorism. And there were several themes that emerged. This first theme, awareness of low racial representation. So one student said, quote, I felt like my program is very hesitant to talk about race or even the fact that I'm the only Black person in the program. Like when I bring it up, everyone gets uncomfortable. And I'm like, okay, you guys clearly chose this for a reason, but when I bring it up, it makes you uncomfortable. So awareness of low racial representation was one thing. Another theme was around expectations. Quote, where I'm from, not that many people do well educationally, so there's a responsibility that comes with once you make it from one status to another status or a higher status. Now these people are looking at you too as an example, as that role model. You think I'm doing something great, but I'm just this kid trying to make things happen. There is the questioning intelligence thing. Quote, when I got accepted to graduate school, I received a fellowship. And once I found out that no one in our program received the same kind of fellowship that I received, and that my fellowship had diversity in the title, that made me feel like it didn't have anything to do with how smart I was, but the fact that I was the only black person in my program. And that probably heightened the imposter phenomenon for me. And I felt like everyone in my program probably knew that I received that fellowship. And so it's some of the unintended consequences of giving, sort of these prestigious, sort of awards, and not understanding or realizing that they're, that they're, again, unintended sort of consequences. So questioning intelligence. Psychosocial costs. Quote, on my first day in the program, I thought maybe the other black female students didn't show up, first and last, and then by day 4, I realized I was literally one of 2 black women. I was sad and I was really lonely. I remember, like, if I got caught on in class or another black student got caught on in class, the evil eye I would give them if they were not on their stuff, meaning being prepared to answer the question adequately. I was just kind of like, how dare you? There's like 5 of us black students in this whole class, how dare you not be prepared? So the psychosocial costs and the pressures and the stress of having to represent your, quote, race. And then there was the theme of explaining success externally. So one student said, I pray a lot. I pray more than I've ever prayed before. God, brought me this far. I pray a lot, so a lot of my success I attribute to God too, because sometimes I'm like, I don't know how I performed well on this exam or paper or any of that. All right, so these were some of the major things that we found with these black graduate students. So just let me summarize very quickly. Few studies have examined the association between imposter feelings and achievement. Imposter feelings may prevent women from excelling more than men. That's tentative, we need to do more research, of course. The current ways that we conceptualize impostorism don't reference racism or discrimination in the environment, and that we believe that the imposter phenomenon needs to be reconceptualized to be more sensitive to racialized experiences. So, after saying all of that, what can we do? We don't want to feel hopeless. Like, is there anything that we can do? And there are strategies both at the individual level and at the level of the institution that we could employ. Individual strategies. One strategy that has been suggested is to document your successes. Now, why is this important? Well, oftentimes when people do good things, they tend to minimize it. They don't remember, they conveniently forget, or they just compartmentalize it in ways where they don't remember it. So we tell people, look, be systematic, document your successes. Keep a journal of some sort, acknowledge, document it so that you can revisit it and be reminded that you've actually done some great things. It sounds so simple, but it's so powerful because, again, we tend to not give ourselves the credit or remember the things that we've done well. So be intentional, document your successes. And then 2, own your accomplishments. And this is important because as a society, we have been socialized to not like people whom we see as being braggadocious. We don't like people who are full of themselves. We don't like people who think that they're all of that. And that's not what we're saying here. What we're suggesting here is that it's okay to be proud of the things that you've accomplished. It's okay to own your accomplishments. And you can do that in a way where you're not being obnoxious. You're not like rubbing in people's faces. You're simply saying, you know what, I've worked hard. I not just worked hard, but I have established and achieved a certain level of success, and I need to be okay with it. I need to embrace that. So own your accomplishments. Talk to a colleague or friend. Too often, people who experience imposter feelings suffer in silence. And if we go back to the previous slide about the external environment and the tremendously competitive and high-stakes environments that we find ourselves in, people don't like to give people anything that they perceive to be a form of weakness, a sign of weakness. We want to show ourselves to be these incredibly strong individuals who are impervious to self-doubt. But talk to a colleague or friend if you have these feelings, because chances are you are not alone. In fact, we know based on the research that you are definitely not alone. So don't suffer in silence. Talk to other people, and you will likely find that they have dealt with those feelings as well. Learn from your mistakes. Again, going back to the maladaptive perfectionism, you know, none of us is perfect, and it's okay to make mistakes, but don't be defined by your mistakes. Learn from them and grow from them. And then finally, as a psychologist, I would be remiss if I did not say, in some instances, you might need to seek professional treatment, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, as we know, this idea of the imposter phenomenon emerged from a clinical context. So if you find that if it's disrupting your life to the degree that you are really being bothered, seek treatment for mental health. Now, these are individual strategies, and when I initially started doing these talks, I was only doing strategies on doing individual strategies. And then I quickly came to realize that some of the critiques of the imposter phenomenon, which we haven't really gotten into, we don't have time to get into here, some of the critiques have been placing the onus on the individual and not looking at the environment as being contributors to imposter feelings. And so once I made that course correction, I said, you know what, we can't just focus on individuals. We've also got to look at what's happening in the environment, what's happening at the institutions, and what can the institution do to address imposter feelings. All right, so there are a few things that can be done, and these are mostly within the educational context, though certainly if I was speaking to a more business-oriented audience, these would look a little bit different. The presence of retention and support programs, I mean, which go by various names, so it's the institution's sort of acknowledgement that we play a role in students being able to be successful, because we recognize that there are things happening in the environment that may contribute or that may impede their ability to sort of maximize their potential. Providing mentors for students, this is a very common intervention that we see in most universities. Providing mentors is incredibly important for individuals who are, especially minorities. I mean, all people can benefit from mentors, not just minoritized students, but minoritized students especially can benefit from mentors, because these are individuals who can say, you know, I have been where you are, and I have felt what you are feeling, and I made it through. So providing mentors for these minoritized students is very important. Teachers addressing climate issues, going back to my STEM examples, how many times, again, I can't tell you how many times I've had African American students report the experiences of discrimination where they're in a class and students are left to their own devices to go into these groups, and they're being left out, they're being excluded. So professors should do something about that. My suggestion is for professors to create the groups themselves and not to allow students to do it, because there's too much, we know too much about what happens when you allow students to do that. So professors taking more control and addressing these climate issues. Having senior leadership establish a safe climate of transparency. The messages that we receive from all levels of administration are very important, and then prioritizing and increasing, prioritizing increasing student diversity. The thing that goes without saying, University of Michigan has done this for a number of years. These are just some of many other strategies that can be employed by the institution to address imposter feelings. So in summary, a majority of people have experienced imposter feelings. We know this. And imposter feelings can both help and hurt achievement, but there's so much more that we need to research to learn about this. Women and racially minoritized groups are especially susceptible to imposter feelings. Now, and make sure that you hear me correctly. I'm not saying that men are not susceptible to imposter feelings. Men are very much susceptible, but what we know is that women and minoritized folks are especially susceptible. So that means, but we're all susceptible. And the susceptibility of racially minoritized groups to imposter feelings is related to representation and experiences of discrimination. And imposter feelings are not a life sentence. Individual and institutional strategies can be used to successfully combat them. And I will end by shamelessly plugging my recent edited book. We have some contributors to the book in the audience. So, yes. But very excited about this book. And I also want to turn your attention to an article that I wrote introducing this idea of a racialized imposter phenomenon published in the Harvard Business Review. called "It's Time to Reconceptualize What, quote, imposter syndrome means for people of color." Very easily accessible article if you're interested. And there are some resources, and that's all I have for you. Thank you. Peace. That was a lot.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. I just one comment and one question. The comment is, I remember reading a while back that, and this wasn't in relation to the imposter phenomenon, but when little girls do well in school, their parents say, "You're so smart," and when little boys do well in school, they say, "You must have worked really hard." And so it's interesting that you tie the relation between intelligence and hard work amongst as to the prevalence of women. Now, presumably this was for a general majority audience. The question is, do you still find gender differences among the African American and the Asian American in terms of who's more susceptible to imposter syndrome, imposter phenomenon?
Oh, so good question. So you're asking an intersectional question, looking at both race and gender.
Yeah, because does the racial sort of supersede the other factor?
So we haven't, as of yet, found like race by gender differences, but I will add a caveat around the gender differences, because there's been some recent developments in the literature. So for the longest time, well, it was believed that there were gender differences in imposter feelings, that with women reporting higher imposter feelings. That was sort of what Pauline Clance initially said, is what she observed. Once it was subjected to empirical scrutiny, the findings were really equivocal. There were some findings that supported that. There were other findings that did not. In my own research, I have found sometimes women reporting higher imposter feelings, sometimes they didn't. Now, a recent meta-analysis was published, and the meta-analysis found that, in point of fact, women do tend to report higher imposter feelings than men, which that meta-analysis was published after the book was published, because we have a chapter on imposter phenomenon and gender, and that chapter says a little bit, communicates a slightly different message. So it doesn't deal with the intersectional piece of race and gender, but there have been developments around just what we know about gender and imposter feelings.
Thank you so much for the talk. So my question is, in terms of gender difference, I'm wondering if you think it's just a matter of like how often different genders report their insecurity or, like imposter syndrome, instead of like, because a lot of the examples or research show that women more susceptible to imposter syndrome, but like in fact, do you think like genders might be like, there is not that much difference?
Well, if I'm following your question, I do think that part of what might account for gender differences can be probably linked to differences in gender socialization. We know that women tend to be more open, for example, for help seeking, tend to be more open to sort of acknowledging, sort of maybe emotional, mental health struggles that they might be having. Men tend to be socialized to kind of keep it to themselves, and perhaps that sort of gender socialization might contribute to some of the gender differences that we would report or that we see. So I wouldn't discount that.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question. So, is it any research that look at the developmental changes in the imposter syndrome? So I would say with age, people change, right? So there are some age differences in this phenomenon, right? Would you say that with age, people became less sensitive to that?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a lot of empirical data to support that, but the little that we have would support that, and it makes sense, right? So as you, and in fact, I can refer to data that I collected with Black attorneys, a few years ago, and I gave a presentation to an association of minority attorneys, most of whom were black. And there were attorneys who were fresh out of law school, and then there were attorneys who had been practicing attorneys for 30 years. And I collected data on impostorism. And to your point, the black attorneys who had been in the field for 30 years reported much less imposter feelings than those who were more newly minted lawyers. And so I think it logically follows that with age and experience, you know, there's probably more self-assuredness, there's probably a bit more confidence. Not to say that you're immune from imposter feelings, but relative to those who have less, you know, sort of experience, you're probably going to feel more self-assured, more confident, and less, and have less imposter feelings. So I think there's something to that.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you exactly the same as placebo-nocebo effect. Does it appear similar as placebo-nocebo effect?
So are you asking about the placebo effect?
And nocebo, N-O-C-E-B-O, like kind of like some attitudes that I don't trust. It will not be good for me. Any similarities in the brain?
Oh, I'm going to confess my ignorance. I'm not familiar with the nocebo effect. If I heard you.
Yeah, it's opposite of placebo.
Oh, this is just the opposite of placebo.
So it's also.
Okay. Okay. So are you asking, has there been any research examining the placebo?
Like, is that very similar as nocebo effect? You know, I don't trust myself.
No, it's fine. To my knowledge, there has not been any research examining, you know, placebo or nocebo effect with impostorism. The good thing about this area of research is that it's wide open in terms of there's so many more questions that we need to pursue, so much more information that we need to better understand this idea of the imposter phenomenon. The work that I'm doing at the University of Michigan with some of my graduate students and some of my colleagues across the country, we're attempting to really develop a firmer and better and a deeper understanding. Part of the challenge of doing work in this area is that the imposter phenomenon is such a popular concept that everybody and their mama thinks that they are experts in it. If you Google the imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome, you'll see so many people reporting themselves to be experts. There's a lot of self-help books, and so there's a lot of misinformation that's out there. Now, you're asking the type of question that requires deep thought, that requires a level of sophistication that we don't see in the popular discourse around the imposter phenomenon. So I'm excited with the work that we're doing at the University of Michigan and other places to deepen our understanding of this experience.
I wanted to say thank you for bringing it to everybody's attention, just a couple of aspects of the imposter phenomenon. So I've been going to see a therapist for the past 2 years because as a kid, even still now, a lot of the times when I would have these accomplishments and things that people would give to me, I felt like either they weren't deserved or like they were luck. And the reason that oftentimes I wouldn't even acknowledge the fact that I won them or even share them with people is the fact that, like you were saying, I didn't want to grow an ego or somehow outwardly put them onto other people, then bringing them down. And the thing is that I thought was interesting was the aspect of race in that. So I also grew up in a very white area, and both of my parents are white, and there was very few, little Asian representation in the town I was from, and I had no idea that was an influence at all. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. I think that was very interesting. But I'm just very curious as to if there are no real, because I was never really told a lot of things of the aspect of, oh, you're so smart, all of those things, because I usually just brushed those off. It was more of is it possible for the imposter phenomenon to kind of come from more of an internal thing of you deciding that and telling yourself these things and not having external factors heightening them, as opposed to them being reflections of those things influencing them?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's why I try to highlight both sort of internal and external sort of influences. I don't think it's an either or. And I think it's context driven. It differs from person to person. You know, my main issue is that with the sort of original and the traditional sort of approach to the imposter phenomena, it tends to solely or disproportionately just focus on the internal part, which is important, and not pay sufficient attention to the external contributions to those feelings. But no, it can certainly originate sort of internally.
Thank you.
Thank you for a very informative talk. I was thinking, so you showed two video clips of two very accomplished minority women. All their accomplishments have been validated. Do they slowly, with time, they get rid of that imposter syndrome?
You know, if we go to the clip, if we go to Viola Davis, for example, when she won the Oscar, at that point she was already very accomplished, very well established, and she reported those feelings. Now I don't know them personally, so I can't speak to whether they currently feel that way or not. But it's my belief, and you can take it for what it's worth. It's my belief that people don't always fully get over imposter feelings. That there could be triggers and there could be circumstances that might lead to someone feeling more susceptible to those imposter feelings. Now, I'm saying that not necessarily based in data, but just sort of anecdotally my own lived experience. But I think that's an incredibly important question, because people will ask, well, can't we get to the point where people will never feel imposter feelings ever? That's what we want. And I don't know the answer to that question. It's certainly not the case for me, but maybe it is for someone else, I don't know.
Thank you very much for all the information. So I have a question. Let's see, whatever happened, let's see, I feel that I have that syndromes. I messed a little bit at the beginning, so whatever I understand, and I feel that I have that syndrome and that kind of issues I'm going through. So what should I do?
So your question is, I feel like I identify with many of the characteristics that you've described about the imposter phenomenon, and what should I do?
No, what should I do if I have those syndromes? If I feel that I have those syndromes and, somehow, so what should I do? Therapy, like some other kind of practices, or what is better to do?
Well, I mean, if we go back to one of the slides that I had toward the end, I mean, therapy is one of the options that I think I mentioned. So, and again, as a psychologist, although not a practicing, sort of psychologist, I would always recommend seeking therapy if that's something that you feel like you need. Another suggestion that I gave was taking the time to document your successes.
Oh, that's what you were saying.
So that's what I was referring to. That slide. So there are several things. Now, I will say this, and I'm thinking of looking at my one of my graduate students here who is doing work in this area. Like, we need to do a lot more empirical work to provide documentation for successful ways to intervene on these imposter feelings. A lot of what I shared with you is not empirically supported. It's sort of almost like common sense, or sort of things that seem intuitively correct, but we don't really have a lot of empirical support for ways to intervene, and that's the work that Danielle and other folks are doing now. And we're very excitedly waiting for her to complete her work.
Yeah, if I will write down my accomplishment, I will think that, oh, I'm lying to myself.
Yeah, and that's when I would say, you know what, a therapist might be helpful.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.